Okay, so let's start by exploring our first loop type known as for loops. So what is a for loop? Well, the for loop in Python is used to iterate over a sequence. So a sequence like a list, a tuple, a string, or any other iterable object. So let's take a quick look at the syntax we need to use when constructing a loop. So we start, as the name suggests, with the keyword for. We then place a variable name of choice that will store the value of each element that is contained in the sequence on each iteration. So we'll call this for the time being element, but you can call this whatever you like as long as it complies with variable naming conventions. We then put the keyword in, and then we put the sequence that we want to iterate over. So for the time being, let's put a list sequence with a list of 5 integers from 1 to 5. So let's pause and think what this code will do. It will first store the first element in the sequence inside the variable called element. So it takes 1 and stores it inside element. And then it will execute the code block that we place after the colon, just like we saw with conditional statements. Now when the code has finished running, the for loop automatically runs again, this time taking the second item and storing it in the variable name that you stipulated in the for loop. In this example, it's element. The code after the colon is then executed. It then takes the third element and runs the code, and so on until all elements in the sequence have been iterated over. When the last element is iterated over, the for loop will stop. So for this example, let's just do something simple and print the item that is stored in the variable element on each iteration of the for loop. So in the body of the for loop, i.e. after the colon, we will put print, and then inside parentheses we'll put the variable name element. When we run the code, you can see that the first iteration has stored 1 in our variable called element, and then the value was printed to the screen. The second time round, 2 was stored in the variable called element, and we then print 2 to the screen, and so on. So a simple concept. We simply go over a sequence taking each element one at a time. And we can then choose what we want to do with this element in the code block. So let's use for loops for some practical purposes. Let's say we want to find the sum of all integers in a list. We'll first of all create a list of numbers, so we'll call the variable numbers, and we'll put a list with values 1 to 10. So now we have our sequence that we want to iterate over. Let's start creating our for loop. So we put for to start our for loop, and then we provide a variable name. In this example, I'm simply going to put num. We can then put the keyword in, and then we can put the sequence that we want to iterate over. So in this example, we put numbers. We can then put a colon. So seeing as we want to sum each element in the list numbers, how would we go about doing this? Well, it would make sense for us to create a variable that stores the sum so we can keep a track of the total as the iteration progresses. So just above our for loop, I'm going to create a variable called total, which stores the number 0. Inside of the main body of the for loop, I can now put total equals total plus num. Now what this will do on the first iteration is it will take the value total, which stores 0, and then it will add num to it. So on the first iteration, it will add 1 to 0, and then total would store 1. On the second iteration, total is now 1, and it will add the value stored in num, which we know would be 2. So 1 plus 2 would give us 3. 3 would be the value stored in total. On the third iteration, we then have 3 plus whatever is stored in num, which we know would be 3. So we end up getting a sum of 6, and we continue through the for loop. Now we've seen this syntax before, and we know there's a more efficient way of writing this, so we can actually change this to be total plus equals num, which will simply add the value stored in num to the value that is stored in total. So after this for loop, if we put print and then inside parentheses, we just call the variable name total, you can see that when we run the program, we get 55 returned. So we've used a for loop in order to sum all the values in a given sequence. Now we've previously touched upon a built-in function called range, which enables us to generate a sequence of numbers. So for example, if we put range brackets 10, it will generate numbers from 0 to 9, i.e. it produces 10 numbers. Now if you remember, we can also define the start, stop and step size within the range function. So if we wanted numbers 1 to 10, we could put range brackets 1 as the starting number, 11 as the stop number, as we know we go up to but not including that number, and if we wanted to see every odd number, we could put comma 2, which would then start at 1 and bring back every other number. But for the time being, we'll leave this range function as 1, 11. Now the range object is very smart in a way because it doesn't generate every number that it contains when we create it. It would be inefficient if it did, as this would have to then store all the values in memory. What the function does is simply remembers the start, stop, and step size that you stipulate in the function call and generates the next number on the go. So in our previous example, we've used a list and we've manually entered the numbers. If we now try to utilize the range function, we could put something like for num in, and then we can put the range of numbers using the range function that we want to generate. So we'll put range brackets 1, 11. We can then put a colon. For the time being, if I just print out num, you can see that when we run this code, we print out numbers 1 to 10, just like we would expect because the for loop is iterating through the range function that we've stipulated. Now let's produce the same result as we did in our previous example. If we were to create a variable called total and set this equal to 0, I can now put for num in range 1 to 11, and rather than printing out the num, I want to put total plus equals num. When we now print total using this for loop, we get 55, so the same result as our previous example. The only difference being we've been more efficient in the way that we're producing the for loop. Okay, so let's now iterate through some other sequences. And we'll start with lists of strings. So if I were to create a variable called hobbies, and inside square brackets we put the hobbies sport, music, and coding, we know that we can iterate through this list. So a basic example, we could put for I, with I being the variable name in this instance because it's quick and easy. We can then put in hobbies, colon. We can then print I. You can see here we then just print out sport, music, and coding to the screen. But I want to add a little bit more. So inside the print function, I'm actually going to precede this with the string I enjoy and follow this with a space, plus I. Now what this will do is on each iteration, it will print out I enjoy, and then it will add each element that's stored in I on each iteration of the for loop. So we now get I enjoy sport, I enjoy music, and I enjoy coding. Now to really understand the concept and to mix different functions that we've seen so we can really get a grasp of the data structures that we're working with, how else have you been able to access elements in a list? Now if you're thinking, I know we can access elements in a list by indexing, you would be right. So how can we use indexing in this example? Well, if you remember, if we put hobbies and then a set of square brackets and then put 0, we access the value sport. If we change this to 1, we access the value music. And 2 would give us coding. So theoretically, if I were to print out hobbies and then put square brackets, we would want to iterate through numbers in order to access the values in the list. So let's think about this. How do we generate numbers from 0 to 2, which would be our complete list? Well, I could use the range function. So I could put for I in range, and then inside the brackets, I could put 3, seeing as that would generate a range of numbers from 0 up to 3 but not including, so from 0 to 2. But what if we didn't know how many items were in our list? What function can we call to give us the amount of items in a list? Now we can use the len function. So inside of the range function, we know we want to get the value 3, but that's because we have a small number of items to count. But if I were to put len brackets hobbies, what this will do is generate the number 3 for us because the len function counts the amount of hobbies in the list. So we now have for I in range brackets len brackets hobbies, we can then put the code we want to execute. So we could print something like I enjoy with a space, and this time we can plus our indexing. So we could put plus hobbies open square brackets, and for the time being I'm just going to put 0. Now if I do this, you can see that we print I enjoy sport 3 times. But because we know the variable I in this for loop will change from 0 to 1 to 2, if I change 0 in the square brackets to bi, we now print out I enjoy sport, I enjoy music, I enjoy coding. So we're using a combination of data structures, built-in functions, and for loops to generate dynamic output. Now unsurprisingly, we can do the same with strings. This time let's do a different example. Let's say we wanted to count the amount of letters in a given sentence. So if I create a sentence which will store in a variable called sentence, and we put I love coding with Python, let's create a for loop to count the amount of O's we have in this sentence. So I could put for and then create a variable, so we'll call this letter, in sentence, which stores the sentence we've just created. We can then in the main body start to count the O's. Now we've learnt all the syntax we need to do this, but as you haven't seen this before, let's go through it step by step. So first of all, we need to create a conditional statement. So we can start by putting if letter is the same as the string O, then we can put a colon. So now we know for each iteration of this for loop, we're going to check each letter to see if it's equal to the letter O. And if it is, we then want to do something. So what do we want to do? Now in a similar way to how we tracked the sum in our first example, we can create a variable called count, and we'll place this above the for loop so it's defined before we start iterating. And we'll set the count to initially be 0. So in the main body of the conditional statement, which resides inside the for loop, we can now put count plus equals 1. So let's think about this. What will happen? Well, if the letter does equal O and therefore evaluates to true, then the code underneath will execute. So we will add 1 to the value that's stored in count at the time of the iteration. So afterwards we can then print to the screen how many O's there are in this sentence. So we can simply put print, and inside the parentheses we could put count. When we do this, we get 3. And if we count manually, you can see we have an O in love, coding, and Python. So 3 is the correct result. Now to make this more interesting, we could add a sentence to our print. So we could start with there are, then we can plus count, then we can plus another string, which is letter O's found. Now I just want to pause for one moment. If we run this code, we will run into an error, but can you see why? Well, it's because we're trying to concatenate an integer with strings, and we can't do that. We can only concatenate strings to strings. So in order to convert this count variable into a string, we can proceed count with the built-in str function, which will convert the value 3 into the string 3. But for sentence purposes, that's absolutely fine. So now when we execute the code, we get there are 3 letter O's found. So we've seen numerous examples here of for loops, how we can use them to iterate through lists, how we can use them to iterate through strings. Obviously the same can be done with tuples. We've also seen how the range function and the len function can come in handy in order for us to access elements in a list by indexing. In the next video, we're going to recreate the fizz buzz game using techniques covered in this video.